Welcome to another episode of the Innovating Together podcast. I'm your host, Bridget Burns with the University Innovation Alliance. And today I am delighted to bring a panel presentation that was filmed live at the ASU+GSV Summit this year that I think is so in alignment with the work that we do at the UIA. And it was such an important conversation that I wanted to make sure to share it with you. First, know that the Innovating Together podcast is sponsored by Mainstay and also the Carnegie Corporation of New York. So we're grateful for both those sponsors. This panel, what I wanted to share with you about it is it's about the alignment in perspectives between colleges and universities and students. And the subheading for the panel is Aligning the Planets, Students are from Mars and Universities are from Venus. It features voices including Patrick Methvin, who's the director of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Postsecondary Success Portfolio, Scott Pulsipher, the president of Western Governors University, Michael Sorrell, who's the president of Paul Quinn College, and Marjorie, who's the president of the Council for Independent Colleges. So as you can anticipate, those are really interesting perspectives. They sit at different vantage points and altitudes, and that's why it was such a great conversation that I wanted to share with you today. So thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy this conversation from the ASU+GSV Summit.
Good morning, everyone. So excited to be here today. We got to have a rich conversation that is perfectly timed, given the emerging changes happening in society. We are in a moment where there's rapid technological change, significant shifts in emerging student populations, the onslaught of AI. We also have very real concerns being articulated by the public and students and employers. And it feels often like as if universities and students might be operating in different orbits with different intentions or different needs. And so the purpose of this panel is to talk about the dynamic between universities and students and how we can better align them. You recall the book from the 80s about when men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Well, turns out we have a similar dynamic happening in higher education. So I'm delighted to bring to you a collection of experts from a variety of spaces in the sector. And so, given that as our dynamic today to talk about those challenges around the alignment, I want each of you to share, based on where you sit in the ecosystem, what exactly is a good example or emblematic of that dynamic, that lack of alignment. So Patrick, as a funder, as someone who observes the entire ecosystem, for you, what's something that really is indicating that?
So maybe I'll take a different tact than the dynamic between students and institutions and just call out there's a pretty divergent view even within students. And so if you were to look at students who identify in multiple different ways, they have very, very different views of the value of higher education. And so that creates a little complexity for us. The good news is there's a ton of great research coming out about this topic. Strata has put out some phenomenal research, Lumina with Gallup, Third Way, others, and that allows us to understand this in a deeper way. And so let's just take one example of that divergence. If you look at students and how they identify, or actually learners, how they identify, ranging from I have a college degree to I attended college, or I'm currently attending college, or look at that by first-gen status or race or gender, you can see divergence as wide as the following. The question asked, is college good value? Not modified by value for what or anything like that. If you look at those different identities, and more importantly, the intersection of those, you see a range from 80% saying, yes, absolutely, it is valuable, to 40%. And so if students are the Mars in this one, is that the deal? Then I would say Martians are not monolithic, and I'd like us to bring that into the conversation today.
Marjorie, now you work with private colleges around the country. For you, from that vantage point, where do you see it standing up the most?
Yes, speaking really of the sort of traditional aged, 18 to 22 undergraduate population, I think your point is a good one. For students, the learning is a piece of what they expect to get out of a college education. But there's a whole suite of activities, experiences that students are looking for that really can best be provided in a residential setting. A lot of those things have to do with the relationships they build with their professors, the relationships they build with each other, practicing skills essential for a flourishing democracy, learning to be leaders by the work they do in clubs and co-curricular activities. And I think we often forget how, from the student's perspective, this is an integrated experience. We do a lot of conversation about unbundling, and for many learners of different ages, that can be a very attractive proposition. But for young people, particularly those first-time college students, the bundling is essential, and we have to figure out ways to understand the value of that and then continue to think about how we provide access and make it affordable for as many students as possible.
Michael, given working at a small HBCU and a work college, you have a vantage point into employment and the challenges of students. We've just heard a bit about the issues, but for you, is there something else that's different that stands out that shows exactly where this lack of alignment is?
Sure. I would actually argue that we've got students from under-resourced communities being the sun, and then you've got Mars and Venus being the 40 schools that all pretend to be top 20, and then the rest of the families and students, right? Because here's what happens. The top 40 schools all want to subscribe to something called lifelong learning. The students from under-resourced communities, which, by the way, are the majority of students coming to college now, they want to talk about lifelong earning. Lifelong learning and lifelong earning have a little bit of an alignment issue. Now, they shouldn't, because they actually go hand in hand. But you have to have conversations where people are willing to acknowledge that we have to do this a little bit differently now. There's nothing wrong with talking about certifications. There's nothing wrong with talking about and helping students have apprenticeships, or in our case, internships, because that helps reduce student loan debt, which is incredibly important. It helps provide readiness for the job, the workforce, which is incredibly important. So it doesn't mean that we can't do these things together, but this antiquated model where all we're going to do is see how many people can become Research 1 institutions. Listen, I think that's great, and I love research. I am the beneficiary of degrees from Research 1 institutions. But it turns out the majority of people coming to colleges now are more interested in getting jobs than what your research portfolio is. So you can do both, but you have to understand and meet people where they are to keep them engaged.
Scott, round it out for us. So you've heard about this perspective from these different vantage points, but how is it different at WGU? You actually implemented some of these innovative models. You've already done some, personalized learning for students. So, but there still has to be some of this tension existing where you see this, the objectives and needs of students are a little bit different than the institution. For you, where does that show up?
Yeah, I would certainly say that the biggest contrast I see between institutions and students is what Michael is hinting at. One, I don't think we're confused at all about ultimately what the primary objective of individuals who are pursuing education is, which is it is a pathway to a great opportunity. It's a pathway to a self-determined life. It's a pathway to actually economic mobility and self-reliance. That's the objective that they're actually pursuing, and I don't think we at WGU are confused about that at all. However, to your question, there are plenty within our sector that always ask us questions about how are you solving for social development engagement? How are you solving for peer-to-peer connection? How are you solving? And I just had one of these conversations last week, and my short answer is we're not. That's not part of, to some degree, I'm concerned a little bit with Marjorie's point, which is we don't think it's part of a big, holistic, integrated value proposition. I think we have to be really careful we don't create some massive monolith that's supposed to be serving all these different purposes that's really hard for the student as a consumer of that to discern exactly what they're expected to get. But the other thing I would just simply offer is that institutions 200 or so years ago, pre-First Industrial Revolution, They were the ones who were actually developing pathways, meaning degrees in fields that were directly relevant to the workforce. That's when the modern baccalaureate actually came about. You actually now had degrees in engineering and in marketing and management, et cetera. They actually designed and developed them because they knew they had to be relevant to the workforce. But now we're talking about that as if that's some secondary consideration to citizenry. And what I don't like is to somehow diminish the value of actually getting a great job. That, in fact, I've never met an engaged citizen who doesn't also have a great job. That, in fact, they are not contending value propositions. They are one and the same. And the most important one is the freedom of actually being able to live the life that you want to. And economic mobility is probably one of the single greatest outcomes, and somehow that still seems lost on too many institutions.
I would just add to that we have to think about what a great job means for this generation of students. I think the radical disparity of wealth that we're seeing growing in this country means that what counts as a great job is really shifting. And I think part of what we're seeing around the anxiety of what higher education is the growing sense, particularly among middle-class Americans, that there's a shrinking pool of great jobs. And that we are preparing students for a world that is very different than the world that we entered into and what we imagined. It can't just be about the first job. It has to be about the career trajectory, the path. I think we would all agree on about that. And we're working with, in many cases, different populations of students.
So I want to go to the concept of value and perception, because one of the pieces that's coming into play here is the public and the feedback that we're getting, which you're getting a little bit of that. And Patrick, the Gates Foundation has done a lot around public value and tried to surface exactly what's going on. When I hear skepticism about the value of higher education and whether or not the four-year degree is still relevant, the feedback I get from institution leaders is often, nah, my degrees are fine. Very defensive, very only my institution, not like really willing to listen. And so you just heard about kind of where this misalignment exists, and I'm wondering, is it miscommunication? Because often people think, oh, it's just better marketing. We need to market better. But you've actually worked at this, and you understand what's underlying this value concern. Can you share what you think needs to change?
Yeah, so first, I want to reiterate, I think we all appreciate that higher education, or education in general, creates lots of different types of value. I don't think it is only about one type of value. For the university folks in the room, faculty or whatnot, you probably break down your work to, your research, your teaching, and your service. Maybe I'll simplify that a little bit into a 2x2 matrix, because I'm a recovering management consultant, and say, if you think on one axis you've got financial and non-financial, and the other axis you've got personal, private, or societal. Higher education plays in all of those areas, right? And in fact, to Scott's point, it has moved around. The gravity of where that is has moved around over time, right? Before we even had a nation, institutions were formed to be very much in the societal, non-financial, because we were training clergy at that time was what they were doing. Over the past 20 years, it has moved to the exact opposite corner in a big, big way. And I would say over the past 5 years, even more acutely so, which is to the private financial, the ROI or economic mobility question. And so the pendulum is swinging in different ways right now. And so a couple of insights that we have from that. So one, and some of this comes from some work we funded with HCM and Edge Research, where they've looked at this a few years in a row and borrowing from some of the work from Lumina and Gallup that they've studied. So one, always the working learner has been in that corner in a significant way because they have opportunity cost. It is very real. They have bills to pay. They have been in that space. What is interesting is that has been a leading indicator for now high school age students. They are moving in that direction. They are responding in that space in a much, much bigger way than previous. So the implication of that is institutions, Scott, like yours, who have a history of speaking to and serving working learners are actually now going to see a lot of benefit with your submetrics, with your 11th and 12th graders in ways that we have not seen previously. So that's the first thing. The second is their perceptions of how to get that value, that economic value, are changing. So most recently, the top two areas, we gave them a list of like, what are things that you would think would create great economic value for you? The top two things were on-the-job training and some form of certification that is leading to a professionally recognized certificate, so training leading to. Further down the list was 4-year and 2-year degree. Now that's perception. You say, but wait, Patrick, we know empirically We know empirically that the four-year degree, it's got $1 million of additional earnings over a lifetime, and we know what happened in the last 2 recessions, who lost their jobs first, who gained jobs back last. So how can this be? Well, the issue is those learners aren't reading the Georgetown Center of Education and Workforce blog.
They really should. It's quite good.
How dare they do that, right? They're not even reading the Gallup polls, and I don't know what's going. Where are they getting their information? They're getting their information from their aunt who did not graduate, has debt and no degree. They're getting their information from the media about what's happening in higher education. By the way, it's not looking great what they're seeing right now, whether it's between FAFSA and financial aid, whether it's about free speech on campus. These things don't look good. So you can't blame learners to say, is that my first choice? And so I'd say, one of the things we need to think about, aside from it's not just marketing, and yes, media, we're in a bit of a doom loop on that, is what do you take from what they're saying they think is valuable, whether that is kind of apprenticeship or how do you blend that together to create a bit of a both and? And I think there are places represented on this stage that have great examples of that. I would love to hear that, but it's not just the talk, it's not just the marketing. We have to deliver a different offering to students today.
So a great entrepreneur, you're here at ASU+GSV, so there's a lot of founders, there's venture capital, there's education. But a great entrepreneur knows that the rule number one is be obsessed with your customer. Be obsessed with total curiosity about, getting feedback from them. You beta test, and you don't judge the outcome. You try and actually see what they're telling you. So what we're hearing here is feedback. Right? Feedback from the public about what we need. It's not that what you're doing is bad and throw it out. It's, I need something slightly different for this moment. And I want to go to you, Scott, because you have been listening in a way that you've been adapting to what learners want, and you've already created a different model, and you've been implementing. So I just want to understand, what is it that enabled that? Now, I know some governors founded WGU, but what enables you to listen and be kind of obsessed with your customer in a way that you are creating things in real time that are actually adapting to the market that you think is not as possible or a little bit harder for other types of institutions?
Sure. I think it did start with this simple premise that the student, the individual, is the primary beneficiary of everything that we do at WGU. So to deliver value for that individual, what is it that actually then mattered? And it probably came down to 3 simple things. Quality of the curriculum, and we measured that by focusing on the relevancy to the opportunity. So one of the first things we did in that regard is, how do we better engage workforce representation, employers, those that were not traditional academicians, to say, no, we don't want them necessarily designing the curriculum without fundamentally the employer and the workforce input. What is it that you actually want? When we actually did that, then you actually kind of wrote the scope of what those academicians actually had to do. How do you then design and develop curriculum such that the learning outcomes of it are addressing the skills and the competencies that are needed in the workforce, particularly in those strategically important areas? Teacher preparation, nursing and health profession, certainly within fields of finance and management, et cetera, and cybersecurity and technology, et cetera. You had to actually know what were you designing the curriculum to enable the individual to do once they traverse the educational pathway. The second big thing that we focus on was, how do you dramatically personalize the student journey across that academic pathway? And so that's where you had to understand more, what were the things that were disrupting the individual's life that they couldn't focus on the learning? And you start to realize it had little to do with their cognitive ability, it had everything to do with what was going on in the working learner's life. What are all the disruptions that they're dealing with that in fact take them off the task at hand? One simple example of that is what we did is we took all the HERF money that WGU was eligible for, not to actually deploy at our institution, but directly to address students' acute financial needs. And we discovered that as little as $500 dispersed at exactly the right moment could dramatically increase persistence, such that as you're solving an acute barrier, we saw 11 percentage point gains in graduation rates among those who previously had acute barrier from $500 that would cause them to drop out and not complete their courses, et cetera. And that's the kind of needs that we're talking about. It's not the cognitive needs and trying to figure out how to adapt instructional models. We're doing all that too. The third thing I would simply just say is we looked at the cost. I mean, fundamentally, you have to bend the arc of the cost curve in higher ed. I will say, I do find it a little annoying that CNBC loves to give airtime to the price tag of highly, highly, highly selective institutions, as if somehow that creates the narrative about the costs across higher ed. However, we can't ignore the fact that a bachelor's degree in the U.S. is approaching $100,000 total cost all in, not per year, by the way. But it's approaching that. I think we just figured out a different way to make it more accessible by bending the arc of the cost curve. Not surprisingly, we didn't solve for other needs or other value propositions beyond fundamentally acquiring the knowledge, skill, and abilities. So what did we orient to? We oriented to personalized instruction. So a student at WGU, you're going to engage with your course instructor across your 20 to 40 courses. You're going to have a mentor that's going to be with you from the day you start till the day that you end. And you're going to have evaluators always validating your competency on the particular learning outcomes. But when you design that way, guess what we don't have? We don't have buildings that are utilized 15 to 20% of the time. We don't have large campuses that, in fact, are heavily underutilized. We don't have athletics. We don't have student life things. You took out a ton of costs such that a place like WGU, 60% of the budget's going purely to instruction.
So not all of those things seem like they're impossible in other spaces. I do think the cost piece in particular, especially we're talking about student debt, and that's directly connected to what you're talking about with student value, with public value. So actually, Michael, I want to go to you because on the idea of cost, you have done some things that have been non-traditional. You have eschewed the tradition of you kicked out your football team, turned it into a sustainable garden. Well, not the team.
Farm.
The farm.
Don't disrespect our football team that badly.
I will.
All right.
And so you've done some things that people feel like are impossible to do, and they are about your cost. And I'm wondering, from that experience, I'm sure on the front end you thought it was impossible. Now you know it is. What advice would you give to other college leaders who are, again, we have this thing in higher ed called filial pietism, excessive reverence for tradition, and you gave up some of those traditions. It's cheaper now. Tell us about the advice you would give for that.
Yeah, the only tradition I care about are my students. Right, that's it. All right, like we're more in love with our students than we are our traditions. And let me say this. You want to talk about being entrepreneurial? I love what they're doing at WGU, but I'm trying to keep students from having to go to places like WGU to have a positive experience. We looked around and we just asked our students, what's going on? Right? Every innovation that we created an entirely different model of higher education than has ever existed before. And that started because we went into the inner cities of this country, we went into the rural schools of this country, and my staff went, and we sat with the students, we sat with their families, and we asked them, what do you care about? Right? What do you care about? And they came back with a list of stuff, and we weren't doing any of it. Right? None of it, because we were locked in traditional land. We wanted to be a really good small college, the same way everyone else was, and we were failing miserably at that. We were so bad at it that we were going to wind up going out of business. So we looked around and said, what if we became what America actually says it wants? How would that work? So we talked to business, and business said, look, students need to be able to write well, they need to be able to speak persuasively. They need to be able to work well in teams. And they need to have digital competencies beyond Snapchat, Instagram, and Facebook. Well, they don't use Facebook. Instagram and everything else, right? TikTok. And so he said, okay, that forms what we'll do in the classroom. But what people are really saying to us is we can't afford to go to school. We're working more than 20 hours a week. We're working jobs that are having a negative impact on our ability to complete school. Because the job, I don't know if you all know this looks like a crowd that might not have had this experience. The jobs that pay the most when you're a full-time working student are the ones that require a night shift. All right? If you are working all night, you are not in your 8 and 9 o'clock classes. Now, you might physically be there, but you aren't there. And so it damages your ability to complete with the type of grades you need to excel. So you begin to accept this scaled down version of your academic dream. You say, well, I've got to work 20, 25 hours, and I need places that see me for who I am. Thank God you guys are there, right? Well, what about the other folks who don't have those opportunities? Because the data is very, very clear. The majority of students coming out of public schools in America's school system from K to 12 are coming from low-income backgrounds. That means they're Pell Grant students. So outside of our state institutions, flagships that think that it's representative of their state population to enroll 10% Pell Grant students when there are a lot more. The rest of us, the regionals, the small privates, the HBCUs, the tribal colleges, we are taking those students. And what we learned was they need to work. So what we said at Paul Quinn was, why don't we just build a model where we help them get jobs? So we created the Urban Work College model. You come to Paul Quinn, you get a job, right? You work 15 to 20 hours per week in jobs we go out and get for you. And that changes how things look for you. Now, we have 4 pillars of a Paul Quinn education. Number 1 is your subject matter expertise. It's what you major in. 2, experiential learning, which is the work college. 3 is PQCX, which is our credentialing program. You come to Paul Quinn, and every year you get a different credential. The first one is Microsoft Office, because it turns out you can make somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000 a year if you're Microsoft Office certified, which now means you no longer are in poverty. So we've solved that problem out of the gate. The 4th pillar is what we will start in the fall with the help of Goldman Sachs and Babson College, and it's every Quinnite is an entrepreneur. So every Paul Quinn student has to create a job, has to create a company or a business before they graduate. So you get 4 different types of education for a very low cost of $22,000 to $23,000 a year, right? Because you have to speak to the cost, you have to speak to the preparation, but you also have to understand that people coming from the lowest socioeconomic strata in this country need more help without being judged. And so that's how we figured out to speak to it.
So we know that we need to dabble with the public perception, that there's some alignment that needs to happen around interests, and we're actually on the same team. We've talked about debt and about cost, but we've also heard that there are examples of institutions that change, and I work with institutions who change every day. Like, this is not we're not trying to bum you out in the morning about higher ed. We are optimistic. Marjorie, you work with universities around the country, and it is actually just very hard to navigate in higher education right now. They're taking hits every day, especially public institutions. Now, you work with independent colleges, but despite that, you work with some who are further along on this curve than others. And I want you to speak to what are the things that are outside the control of the institution that are getting in the way, that need to be on the table if we're going to actually try and address this.
This has been a fascinating conversation, and I think, the similarities, I think, are clear. You have to understand the students you're aiming to serve. CIC, we represent about 650 independent colleges and universities across the country. Collectively, we serve, those institutions serve more than 2 million students a year, most of them in that traditional age population. And our institutions provide more than $7 billion worth of financial aid. Our net average price is not that different from what you're talking about at Paul Quinn. But a couple things that I think are really important. There was a time when the innovations, especially in sort of the traditional residential four-year model, where those innovations came from the most elite institutions. Harvard invented the major and the general education requirement. Yale invented the sort of student research model, et cetera. That's no longer the case. The innovations in undergraduate education are coming from institutions like you see represented here on the stage, including the vast majority of CIC member institutions, and they're coming precisely for this reason. So just a few examples from our institutions, many of whom our presidents are here in the audience today. CIC runs the largest course sharing consortium in the world. And our students now at CIC institutions have access not only to what's available on their campus, but to thousands and thousands of additional learning opportunities that they can take at no additional cost to them. So they can go locally and they can be educated globally. We are unveiling now a marketplace for exactly the kind of credentials that you're talking about. The research shows that if you're an art history major and you get some kind of certification in project management, your ability not only to get that first job, but to succeed and become a leader in your field is enhanced. And many, many of our institutions now offer those certificates as part of a major or in addition to the major. Many of them are considering ways that they can say to their graduates, you can come back and you can earn these certificates through us at no cost as part of what you have, that lifelong learning piece. So we're seeing a lot of innovation. what is driving and what, as you say,
What's getting in the way?
What's getting in the way?
What are things
So
outside?
why isn't everybody doing that? For some, it is a sense that the water has not risen yet to consume them. Right? If college decisions are being made based on reputation and perceived prestige, and they are, right? Don't just think about the students you're serving. Think about your children. Think about the children of your neighbors. Prestige matters when people make college choices. So if you have a perceived prestige, there's no incentive to change. So that's one piece. And again, that's what gets most of the press. The other thing, though, I think, is this notion that we continue to focus on individual value instead of the value to society. We may not be able to expect that every institution serving every learner has an eye on democracy and the skills you need for democratic citizen, but we better make sure that a lot of them do. And without the kind of support and collective support for young people engaging in those experiences, our democracy is going to become more and more fragile. We're already seeing that.
Okay, so help me out on this.
Yeah, can I touch on that? Because I think this is incredibly important. With the pendulum swinging so strongly to kind of private financial, you could potentially miss out on a lot of these kind of non-financial societal goods. I don't want to live in a country that does not have those benefits, right?
Especially when we're talking about those important 18 to 22-year-old learners.
So I guess the question that I have on that front is, how do you communicate that part, right? So like, when you think about the data, for instance, that is currently available and will become more increasingly available, it will be very, very clear about the economic mobility piece. Scott, you've invented a version of that for WGU. States like Texas are attaching funding formulas to the community colleges specifically on that. That will be transparent. How do you create like transparency for these other things? And this is one where I think HBCUs and TCUs thrive. Like I was just a couple weeks ago at Morehouse, and you see the 5 wells everywhere. You know what they are producing for society. How do you communicate that part?
Well, and again, many of our members have those sorts of missions, right? Many of them are Christian colleges or colleges with a religious mission. So they are very clear about the sort of whole wraparound of experiences that are created beyond just what happens in the classroom. But we have no way of measuring that. There's no federal measurement of that. There's no standardized measurement. The NESE tries to get at some of it. But again, it's only colleges that are doing this that pay attention to the NESE. So, when you think about the NESE, the NESE measures things like, how often during your college education did you have a conversation with somebody from a different background than you? How often did you talk about a difficult issue? Part of the reason why some of our campuses are in flames, very few, is because we're making sure those things happen.
But
those are hard.
Don't we have to be honest, though, about the fact that there's actually a movement to disincentivize students from engaging in that way?
Absolutely.
Right? Like, if we are honest with ourselves, the political climate in this country is actually punishing students and discouraging students from wanting to engage on that level. Right? And look, if we allow that to take place, then shame on all of us. Right? Because we all know better, but we don't want to have that uncomfortable conversation. We don't want to have that uncomfortable fight. So we settle into our own little cubby holes and say, oh, but my life's okay, while Rome burns. And look, we talk about this at Paul Quinn. At Paul Quinn and at the historically black colleges, we were birthed in rebellion. We don't know any other way, which is part of the reason why state legislatures underfund us, because that's an inconvenient group of people to have educated to rebel against the injustices of society. But we're going to have to speak to that, and we're going to have to accept the fact that when we speak to it, it's going to make some people angry, and you're not going to get invited to every party.
And do we want as a country an educated workforce or a trained workforce?
Or an obedient workforce.
A trained workforce will do the job that they're trained for. An educated workforce might begin to ask about the conditions under which they do that work. It's not clear that we're willing to invest societally in that.
Well, I was just going to, just a couple of thoughts. One is, I do think, I come back to the thing that I think Mike was saying and I was saying, which is you have to first define the end that you're actually trying to accomplish. What is the mission you're trying to accomplish? And you have to work backwards from that. And I was just thinking of a couple of things being said that, one, in doing that, you should start questioning the paradigms from which you're innovating from. I really like what Mike was talking about. You kind of just threw out the paradigms as we did at WGU, but I just often find it amusing that most of us in higher ed don't even know why certain things exist. Like fall and winter, spring semesters. Like, are we still all going to work the harvest in the summer? Like, what's going on that we still think we have to follow that model of acquiring knowledge, skill, and ability? Another example that I'd just like to point to is like, why the freak does the credit hour exist? No one understands that that actually emerged by figuring out how to pay faculty to teach the subjects. Not actually as a measure of learning, but now we've so held on to that time being a measure of learning that we don't actually understand whether the students have learned anything in the time we've actually given them. Or the other different paradigms that says, why do we even have faculty around academic freedom and tenure, et cetera? It was mostly designed around research endeavor. But that's not the same as a teaching endeavor of an institution where your students are the primary customer. And do we really need all 4,000 institutions designed like the 100 research ones that we need to have? And so we're not thinking about that. The third key point I would simply make is that you have to then think about what are the measures of efficacy and quality in that design that you have. And with some of the things they're highlighting, I was like, well, what really are the metrics? The notion of prestige, I'm like, that matters to 1% of the population. And it doesn't matter to anyone else. It doesn't matter the students you're talking about, the students we're serving. What they care about is whether or not it's relevant to what I want to do, whether or not my employer is going to regard the education I achieved so that I get the job. I want to know whether it's worth the freaking cost that you're asking me to pay. Like, that's what they care about. And so are you as an institution delivering on those metrics that matter rather than who did we let in? That's a general paradigm that we also got.
Who do we keep out?
Who do we keep out? That's a general paradigm, by the way, that we got trapped into with U.S. News and others, that somehow now highly selective institutions, which, by the way, I think is defined as those that admit less than 50% of their applicants. Yes. We are talking literally about 120 to 150 institutions in the U.S. that somehow create a narrative for the other 18.75 million individuals that are going into higher ed, as if somehow that 250,000 is defining for the rest of us, and we get caught in these traps that somehow prestige matters. So, it doesn't.
But it's not just the students. All of you hire. Every one of you hires. Do you look for prestigious institutions on the resume?
If you do,
yes.
If you do,
yes, you do.
Yes.
Yes, you do. And so you're perpetuating the very issue that he's talking about.
Then we have to also understand why. Let me say this: we wonder why people hate us.
Yeah.
Like, you wonder why people hate us.
Sorry.
We've built a whole system on rejecting people.
You're not in the club. You're not in club. You're not worthy for it. You're like, you don't have the talent. You're like, no, we're going to admit those that we think are valuable.
And so you always hate the people that reject you.
Mm-hmm. So I think we've finally gotten to the point we wanted to get to, which is there are some things that are outside, there's some things that are problematic in our internal value system, and we've prioritized the wrong things, but they can be righted, right? We've seen examples, we've talked about examples that this can change. We've also heard about government and policy is having a real play here. There's also rankings, things that are outside of our control. And so the question is that I want to rapid fire for each of you, one thing that you think you would change if you could magic wand it, that would actually move us in the direction of better aligning the needs of students and institutions. And I think that when we're talking about students, we seem to be lumping in employers as well. So just in general, if you had to choose one thing that you were going to change that would make the biggest difference, Patrick, I'm going to go to you.
I would redefine prestige, and that's going to take everybody. And you see that right now with philanthropy. Strata just this month released their opportunity index, which is saying, like, what are states doing on this? So you see philanthropy, you see states, and it's bipartisan. You could hear on the same day Secretary Cardona talking about value and economic mobility, as you would see Texas roll out a new funding formula focused on incentivizing that. Now, you could say there's some tweaks to that you might make, but every actor in this needs to be working towards redefining that prestige, because it is ridiculous.
Scott, what's the one thing that you would do? I think I already know, but.
I do think I would say the one thing I would focus on is how are we dramatically improving the equity in both access and attainment. The one thing I'm mostly disheartened by is that over the last 50 years, If you came from the top income quartile of households, you went from 40% attainment post-secondary to 70%. But if you were from the bottom income quartile, you went from 6% to 13% over the same 50 years. I think we have one singular mission to reprove that, in fact, that education is the surest path to opportunity. That has to work for everyone that isn't, such that we would actually measure institutions on their ability to enroll those who haven't been enrolled or are non-consumers, and that those that do enroll from those backgrounds, that they actually complete what they came to complete. And third, that they actually got the opportunity that they were supposed to get as a result. I think we have to hold institutions accountable to delivering on that fundamental value proposition. If not, it's not worth it. We're asking the taxpayers, all of us, and the federal government to underwrite a system that fundamentally is about economic and social mobility, and it's not working for those who need it most. That's why I'd reorient all the measurements of it.
Michael, I'm quick. What's your one thing?
Two things. I would fund historically black colleges at the rate that they were supposed to have been funded and legislated to be funded at, which means we would get billions of dollars in back compensation. Two, the Voting Rights Act would be expanded to make sure that it is far easier to get people to vote than easier to discourage people from voting.
All right. Marjorie?
Well, today I would fix the FAFSA, but I would double the Pell Grant, and I would really focus on those students who want, particularly those young people, who want that four-year college experience and see no way to make that happen for them.
All right, well, please join me in thanking our collection of thought leaders here who've helped us navigate this very complex conversation.